Welcome. Tonight we journey through centuries of history, through mountain ranges and city streets, through laboratories and empires. We trace the path of a single plant and the alkaloid it contains, from sacred ritual to global catastrophe. This is the complete history of cocaine, the powder that corrupted dynasties, built fortunes, destroyed communities, and changed the world forever. Before we begin this long journey together, take a moment to settle in. If you enjoyed this exploration, consider subscribing to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Some stories demand our full attention. This is one of them. The sacred leaf, 8,000 years of tradition. High in the Andes Mountains, where the air grows thin and the earth touches clouds, a plant has grown for millions of years. Erythroxylum coca. To those who lived in these heights, it was not merely a plant, it was divine. The story begins not in laboratory or boardroom, but in the ancient past. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been using coca leaves for at least 8,000 years. The plant itself evolved in the high altitudes of northwestern South America, developing over countless millennia the unique alkaloids that would one day reshape human civilization. 4 distinct varieties of coca emerged through both natural evolution and human cultivation: Huanuco coca, Amazonian coca, Colombian coca, and Truxillo coca. Each variety adapted to its environment. Each developed slightly different properties. Each became woven into the fabric of indigenous life. The domestication of coca was not a single event, but a continuous process. Different Amerindian peoples across vast geographic regions independently adopted wild coca plants into cultivation. This contradicts the traditional understanding of crop domestication as emerging from a few distinct centers and spreading outward. Instead, coca cultivation arose organically across multiple locations, each culture discovering the plant's value independently, each learning to nurture it, to honor it. For the Inca Empire, coca was the divine leaf. Its use was carefully controlled, reserved primarily for nobility and religious ceremonies. Priests chewed coca during rituals, believing it brought them closer to their gods. The ruling class used it to maintain clarity of mind during long administrative duties in the capital of Cusco. Warriors were given coca leaves before battles, soldiers before long marches. The leaf sustained them through thin air and exhausting labor. The method of use was remarkably consistent across cultures and across millennia. Fresh coca leaves would be placed in the mouth along with an alkaline substance. This alkaline addition was crucial. Indigenous peoples discovered that combining coca leaves with ash from burned plants, or with lime from crushed seashells, or with powdered granite, transformed the experience. The alkaline environment allowed the cocaine alkaloid to be released and absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth. Without this crucial addition, chewing coca leaves alone produced minimal effect. The practice created a small, rounded bulge in the cheek. Ancient Peruvian pottery depicts figures with these telltale bulges, silent testimony to a practice already ancient when the pottery was crafted. Mummies buried in the high deserts of Peru have been found with coca leaves placed in their tombs, provisions for the journey to the afterlife. In some burial sites, coca leaves dating back to 3000 BCE have been preserved by the dry climate, their presence speaking across 5,000 years about the plant's importance. The effects of traditional coca leaf chewing were mild but significant. Users experienced a slight stimulation, increased alertness, suppression of hunger and thirst, and most importantly in high altitudes, relief from altitude sickness. The thin air of the Andes, where oxygen levels can be 30% lower than at sea level, made every physical task an ordeal. Coca leaves helped the body cope. They enabled work that would otherwise have been impossible. But coca was more than medicine or stimulant. It carried profound cultural meaning. Coca leaves were offered to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, in rituals of reciprocity. Before planting, before harvest, before any significant undertaking, coca leaves were ceremonially burned or buried. The smoke carried prayers skyward. The buried leaves fed the earth that fed the people. This sacred cycle had continued for thousands of years by the time European ships appeared on the horizon. The coca plant itself was remarkably well suited to its environment. It thrived in the moist, warm montane forests on the eastern slopes of the Andes, between 1,500 and 6,000 feet in elevation. The shrub grew to about 6 feet in height, with leaves that were elliptical, smooth, and bright green. Multiple harvests were possible each year. The plant was hardy, resistant to pests, and required relatively little care once established. For farming communities in challenging terrain, coca represented a reliable, valuable crop. Different varieties of coca plants contained different concentrations of alkaloids. The leaves of Erythroxylum coca contained the highest levels of cocaine, typically around 1% of the leaf's dry weight, but cocaine was only one of dozens of alkaloids present in the leaves. Others included cinnamolcocaine, benzoylecgonine, methylecgonine, tropacocaine, and various truxylite compounds. This complex chemical mixture produced effects quite different from isolated pure cocaine. Modern research has shown that whole coca leaf contains nutrients beyond its alkaloid content. The leaves provide protein, vitamins, minerals, and fiber. For populations living in challenging environments with limited dietary variety, coca leaves offered nutritional supplementation alongside their stimulant properties. This made the plant even more valuable to communities in the Andes. The Inca Empire at its height controlled coca production carefully. Coca fields were owned by the state or by temples. The leaves were distributed as payment to laborers, as rewards to successful warriors, as offerings in religious ceremonies. This control over coca gave the ruling class additional power. Access to the sacred leaf became a privilege, a marker of status, a tool of governance. Some scholars have suggested that coca use was more widespread before the Inca Empire consolidated power, and that the Incas then restricted access as a means of social control. Others argue that coca was always considered too sacred for common use. The historical record is incomplete, preserved more in pottery and burial goods than in written texts. But what remains clear is that by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, coca was deeply embedded in Andean society. The Inca road system, one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the ancient world, was maintained partly by workers sustained by coca leaves. Chasquis, the relay runners who carried messages across the empire, were given coca to help them complete their exhausting journeys. These runners could cover up to 150 miles in a day, racing along mountain paths at altitudes where most people struggle to walk. Coca helped make this possible. In the Amazon basin, a different variety of coca, Erythroxylum coca, Ipadu, was cultivated by indigenous groups. These peoples prepared coca differently, toasting the leaves and grinding them into a fine powder that was then mixed with ash from burned yarumo leaves. This mixture, called ipadu or mambay, was carried in small gourds and consumed by placing pinches of the powder in the mouth. The practice persists in some Amazonian communities to this day. Traditional coca use was communal. The coca pouch, called a chuspa, was often decorated with intricate weavings. Offering coca to a visitor was a gesture of hospitality. Sharing coca during work created bonds between laborers. The plant was woven through social fabric at every level. It marked transitions in life, celebrated successes, eased sorrows, connected the living to the divine. When Spanish conquistadors first observed coca use, they were confused and often disdainful. The bulging cheeks of coca chewers seemed grotesque to European eyes. The practice appeared primitive, perhaps demonic. Catholic priests initially denounced coca as an evil agent of the devil, attempting to ban its use among indigenous populations. But economics overrode ideology. The Spanish quickly realized that indigenous laborers forced to work in silver mines and on plantations could not maintain the brutal pace of labor without coca. Miners working in the darkness of Potosí, extracting silver that would flow to Spain and reshape the global economy, were sustained by coca leaves. Without coca, productivity plummeted. The Spanish conquest relied on indigenous labor, and indigenous labor relied on coca. The Spanish reversed their position. Instead of banning coca, they taxed it. A 10% tribute was levied on coca leaf sales. The Catholic Church, which held vast lands in Peru, began cultivating coca on church properties. Spanish merchants monopolized the coca trade. What had been a sacred plant distributed through traditional channels of reciprocity and ritual became a commodity. The transformation had begun. By the 1500s, massive coca plantations were established in the warm valleys east of Lima. Thousands of workers, often indigenous peoples forced into labor under the encomienda system, harvested coca leaves for Spanish overlords. The leaves were transported by llama caravans to the mining centers of the highlands. Spanish authorities carefully recorded coca production and trade, seeing it as a valuable revenue source. The records show staggering quantities. In 1548, the Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon noted that in one valley alone, more than 500,000 baskets of coca leaves were sold annually. The industry was enormous even then, 4 decades after conquest. Indigenous peoples, their traditional social structures shattered, their populations devastated by disease and warfare, found their sacred leaf transformed into a tool of their own oppression. Despite the massive scale of coca cultivation and use, very little coca reached Europe during these early centuries. The leaves were perishable. During the long sea voyage from South America to Spain, coca leaves degraded, losing their potency. European merchants tried to transport coca, hoping to create a market for the exotic plant, but the results were disappointing. The leaves that arrived in European ports were brown, brittle, and largely inactive. Early European scientists receiving such degraded samples concluded that coca held little interest. This would not change for 3 more centuries. Coca remained a South American phenomenon, crucial to the colonial economy of the Andes, but unknown to the wider world. Indigenous peoples continued to use it, as they had for thousands of years, though now under the shadow of conquest and exploitation. The plant that had once been divine was now merely a commodity, a means to extract more labor from exhausted bodies. Yet the traditional knowledge persisted. In remote villages, in mountain communities, the old ways continued. Coca was still offered to Pachamama. Coca leaves were still read by shamans to divine the future. Children still learned which leaves to select, how to prepare them, when to chew them. The sacred meaning had not entirely disappeared, even as the Spanish colonial apparatus commodified and commercialized the plant. This dual nature of coca, both sacred and exploited, both traditional medicine and tool of oppression, would echo through the centuries to come. The plant's complexity, its deep roots in indigenous culture, would be forgotten by later generations of Europeans and Americans who saw only the isolated chemical, the pure white powder, divorced from context and tradition. But here, in the Andes Mountains, in the early centuries after conquest, coca remained what it had always been, a plant that connected people to their land, to their ancestors, to the divine. European discovery and the birth of chemistry. For nearly 3 centuries after the Spanish conquest, coca remained largely confined to South America. European scientists and physicians occasionally wrote about the plant, relying on second-hand accounts and degraded samples. But coca leaves kept their secrets. The active compounds degraded too quickly during the long ocean voyage from Peru to Europe. What arrived in European laboratories was little more than dried plant matter with minimal potency. This began to change in the 1850s. Several factors converged to bring coca to European attention. First, the science of chemistry had matured dramatically. By the mid-19th century, chemists had developed sophisticated techniques for extracting and isolating compounds from plant materials. Morphine had been isolated from opium in 1805, strychnine from Nux vomica in 1818, quinine from cinchona bark in 1820. The age of alkaloid chemistry had begun, and chemists were systematically investigating medicinal plants from around the world. Second, shipping times had improved. Steam-powered ships could make the journey from South America to Europe faster than sailing vessels, giving coca leaves a better chance of arriving in usable condition. And third, There was renewed scientific interest in South American natural products, driven partly by economic motives as European powers sought new commodities and medicines from their expanding colonial holdings. The first major European figure to champion coca was an Italian physician named Paolo Mantegazza. In 1859, Mantegazza returned to Milan after spending time in Peru, where he had witnessed indigenous coca use firsthand. He experimented on himself extensively, chewing coca leaves and carefully documenting the effects. His subsequent publications praised coca enthusiastically, describing its stimulating effects, its ability to banish fatigue, its potential medical applications. Mantegazza's work described coca as a treatment for what he called a furred tongue in the morning, flatulence, and whitening of the teeth. More significantly, he detailed the psychological effects: a sense of well-being, increased mental clarity, heightened physical vigor. His enthusiasm was infectious. Medical journals across Europe began taking notice. Here was a plant with remarkable properties, praised by indigenous peoples for millennia, now receiving scientific validation from a respected European physician. But Mantegazza worked only with the whole coca leaf. The crucial next step, isolating the active compound, required better chemistry and fresher samples. This is where the story becomes more technical, but it is important because this isolation of pure cocaine from coca leaves, marks the transformation of the sacred leaf into something entirely different. In 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Gaedtke succeeded in isolating a crystalline substance from coca leaves. He called this substance erythroxylene, after the plant's genus name. Gaedtke published his findings in a German pharmaceutical journal, but his work received little attention. The isolation was imperfect, the compound not entirely pure, and Gaedtke did not fully characterize its properties. The breakthrough came 5 years later. Friedrich Wöhler, one of the most eminent chemists in Germany, had long been interested in coca. In 1856, he asked a colleague, Dr. Karl Scherzer, who was about to embark on a round-the-world scientific expedition aboard the Austrian frigate Novara, to bring him a large supply of fresh coca leaves from South America. Scherzer succeeded, delivering to Wöhler a substantial quantity of high-quality coca leaves preserved in excellent condition. Wöhler assigned one of his doctoral students, a young chemist named Albert Niemann, to work with the coca leaves. Niemann's task was to isolate and characterize the active principle of the plant. He worked meticulously, describing every step in his doctoral dissertation, which was published in 1860 and earned him his Ph.D. Niemann described a process of extracting coca leaves with alcohol, then treating the extract with various chemical reagents to precipitate unwanted compounds. Through careful fractional crystallization, he obtained colorless, transparent prisms. These crystals, he noted, had an alkaline reaction, a bitter taste, and produced a peculiar numbness followed by a sense of cold when applied to the tongue. He named this substance cocaine, from coca plus the suffix -ine, which was commonly used for alkaloids. Niemann's dissertation is a landmark document in the history of chemistry and medicine. It represents the moment when an indigenous plant remedy became a pure chemical compound that could be studied, quantified, and eventually manufactured. Niemann described cocaine's chemical properties in detail. He noted that it dissolved readily in alcohol and chloroform, sparingly in ether, and hardly at all in water. These properties would become important when physicians later sought to formulate cocaine preparations for medical use. Tragically, Albert Niemann died just a year after completing his dissertation at the age of 26. The exact cause of death is unclear, though some sources suggest complications from laboratory work with toxic compounds. His brief career produced one monumental achievement, but he would never see the revolution his work initiated. For a decade after Niemann's isolation of cocaine, the medical community showed limited interest. Pure cocaine was difficult to produce in quantity, expensive, and its properties were not yet well understood. A few pharmaceutical manufacturers began producing small amounts of cocaine for research purposes, but medical applications remained unexplored. This began to change in the 1870s and 1880s as more chemists and physicians experimented with the drug. One crucial development was the demonstration that cocaine had profound local anesthetic properties. When applied to mucous membranes, cocaine not only numbed the area but also constricted blood vessels, reducing bleeding. This combination made it potentially revolutionary for surgery. The realization of cocaine's anesthetic potential is often attributed to Carl Koller, a Viennese ophthalmologist, who in 1884 demonstrated that cocaine could be used as a local anesthetic for eye surgery. This was a breakthrough. Prior to cocaine, eye surgery was extremely painful and difficult. Patients could not be fully anesthetized with ether or chloroform because they needed to remain conscious and able to follow instructions to move their eyes. Cocaine allowed surgeons to perform delicate procedures with the patient awake, but pain-free. Koller's demonstration at a medical conference in Vienna caused a sensation. Within months, surgeons around the world were using cocaine as a local anesthetic. The use spread rapidly to dental surgery, nasal surgery, and various other procedures. For a brief moment, cocaine seemed like a miracle drug, solving one of medicine's most pressing problems: how to perform surgery without inflicting unbearable pain. But Carl Koller was not working in isolation. His discovery was directly influenced by another Viennese physician who had become obsessed with cocaine's properties. This physician was conducting extensive experiments on himself and his friends, writing enthusiastically about cocaine's potential to treat a wide range of conditions. His name was Sigmund Freud, and his involvement with cocaine would become one of the more controversial chapters in his early career. The Freud episode: Enthusiasm and Tragedy. In the spring of 1884, Sigmund Freud was a young, ambitious neurologist working at the Vienna General Hospital. He was 27 years old, engaged to be married to Martha Bernes, and desperately seeking a scientific breakthrough that would establish his reputation and allow him to support a family. He was not yet the founder of psychoanalysis. That lay years in the future. In 1884, Freud was simply another young doctor searching for recognition in the competitive medical environment of Vienna. Freud learned about cocaine through medical literature. He read reports from South America about coca's energizing effects, Mantegazza's enthusiastic accounts, and preliminary studies of cocaine's properties. He became convinced that cocaine held enormous medical potential. Here, he thought, was his opportunity for scientific glory. In April 1884, Freud ordered his first supply of cocaine from Angel's Pharmacy in Vienna. He began experimenting immediately, primarily on himself. The effects were exactly as described: a rush of energy, heightened mental clarity, a sense of euphoria and well-being. Freud was delighted. He believed he had found a wonder drug. He began writing to Martha Bernes, his fiancée, describing his experiences in intimate detail. In one letter dated June 2, 1884, he wrote with unguarded enthusiasm about how cocaine made him feel powerful, how it banished his depression and self-doubt, how it gave him the energy and confidence he craved. The letters are remarkable documents showing a young Freud unguarded, excited, convinced he was on the verge of an important discovery. By the end of 1884, Freud had published his first major paper on cocaine, titled Über Coca, on coca. The essay is extraordinary, a mixture of genuine medical insight and enthusiastic overstatement. Freud catalogued cocaine's effects systematically, describing their most gorgeous excitement upon first ingesting it, an exhilaration and lasting euphoria, and noting the suppression of fatigue and hunger. He proposed numerous medical applications: treatment for digestive disorders, as an aphrodisiac, to combat depression and neurasthenia, as a stimulant for persons engaged in mental work, as a cure for morphine and alcohol addiction, and as a local anesthetic for surgery. Most of these proposed uses were speculative, based on limited evidence and Freud's personal experiences. But Freud wrote with such confidence that his paper was widely read and taken seriously. Medical journals reviewed it favorably. pharmaceutical companies began producing cocaine preparations for medical use, citing Freud's work as justification. Freud began recommending cocaine to his colleagues, his friends, and his patients. He gave samples to friends, encouraging them to try the drug. He prescribed it liberally. And here the story takes a tragic turn, because one of the people Freud most enthusiastically pushed cocaine on was his close friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow. Fleischl-Marxow was a physiologist, a brilliant scientist, and a colleague of Freud's at the Vienna hospital. He had suffered a terrible accident years earlier while performing an autopsy, injuring his thumb. The injury became infected, leading to chronic pain so severe that Fleischl-Marxow had become addicted to morphine, taking massive doses just to function. Freud, believing cocaine could cure morphine addiction, urged his friend to try it. Fleischl-Marxow took Freud's advice. He began using cocaine, initially finding that it did help with morphine cravings, but he did not stop using morphine. Instead, he now used both drugs. His cocaine doses escalated rapidly. Within months, he was consuming enormous quantities, far exceeding what any modern physician would consider remotely safe. He was spending 6,000 marks per month on cocaine, a fortune. His health deteriorated dramatically. Fleischl-Marxow began experiencing paranoid hallucinations, including the famous cocaine bugs, the sensation of insects crawling beneath the skin. He suffered severe weight loss, insomnia, cardiovascular problems. Freud witnessed his friend's descent but seemed unable or unwilling to connect it to cocaine use. He rationalized that Fleischl-Marxow's problems stemmed from his underlying morphine addiction, not from the cocaine that was supposed to cure it. Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow died in 1891, at the age of 45, his health destroyed by combined morphine and cocaine addiction. The death profoundly affected Freud. By this time, reports of cocaine addiction and overdose deaths were multiplying across Europe and America. The medical community's initial enthusiasm for cocaine was souring rapidly. Meanwhile, Freud had narrowly missed the major medical discovery associated with cocaine. While he had noted in passing that cocaine had numbing effects on the tongue and mucous membranes, he did not pursue this observation. It was his colleague Carl Koller who recognized cocaine's potential as a local anesthetic and received credit for the discovery. Freud was disappointed to have missed what turned out to be cocaine's only lasting medical application. By 1887, Freud had stopped publicly promoting cocaine. His reputation had been damaged by the cocaine episode, as it came to be known. Medical journals that had initially praised his work now criticized him. Reports of addiction, psychosis, and death linked to cocaine use were appearing regularly. Freud's prediction that cocaine was non-addictive and safe had been proven catastrophically wrong. Privately, however, Freud continued using cocaine himself. Letters and diary entries suggest he used the drug intermittently throughout the early 1890s, primarily for depression and to relieve the pain of chronic nasal problems. By 1895, he was still using it, though perhaps less frequently. Medical historians have documented that Freud suffered from nasal congestion so severe that he required surgery, possibly caused or worsened by cocaine use. He finally stopped using cocaine in 1896, around the time of his father's death. The Freud episode offers a cautionary tale about medical enthusiasm outpacing evidence. Freud was a skilled observer and a brilliant thinker, but his excitement about cocaine led him to minimize or ignore warning signs. He saw what he wanted to see, and when contradictory evidence emerged, he found ways to rationalize it. His personal use may have clouded his judgment. The desire for recognition may have pushed him toward overstatement. Yet Freud's cocaine papers, despite their flaws, did contribute to medical knowledge. His systematic description of cocaine's psychological effects was more detailed than any previous account. His observations about cocaine's stimulant properties, its effects on mood and cognition, were fundamentally accurate even if his conclusions about safety were wrong. And some historians have suggested that cocaine's effects on Freud, particularly its tendency to produce rapid, free-flowing speech and thought, may have influenced his later development of psychoanalytic techniques like free association. the scientific world learned important lessons from the cocaine enthusiasm of the 1880s. The need for careful clinical trials, for long-term follow-up, for skepticism about miraculous cure-alls, all became more apparent. Cocaine had been embraced too quickly, with too little caution. The consequences were severe. But the genie was out of the bottle. Cocaine had been isolated, its effects demonstrated, its properties understood. Pharmaceutical manufacturers were producing it in quantity, physicians were prescribing it, and entrepreneurs were finding ways to incorporate it into popular products. The stage was set for cocaine to enter mass consumption, not as a medicine, but as a recreational drug and patent medicine ingredient. The golden age of cocaine! Wine, tonics, and Pope Leo XIII. While physicians debated cocaine's medical merits, entrepreneurs saw opportunity. If cocaine could make people feel energetic and euphoric, why limit it to medical contexts? Why not incorporate it into beverages, tonics, and remedies that anyone could purchase? The result was a remarkable period when cocaine-laced products were freely available, widely advertised, and consumed by millions. The most successful cocaine product of the era was not created by a physician or chemist, but by a Corsican entrepreneur named Angelo Mariani. In 1863, inspired by Mantegazza's writings on coca, Mariani created a product that would make him wealthy and famous. Vin Mariani, a wine infused with cocaine. The creation of Vin Mariani was straightforward but brilliant. Mariani used Bordeaux wine as a solvent to extract cocaine from Peruvian coca leaves. The alcohol in the wine served a dual purpose. It extracted the cocaine from the leaves, and it enhanced cocaine's effects through a metabolic interaction. When the human body processes cocaine and alcohol simultaneously, it produces a compound called coca-ethylene, which has more intense euphoric effects than either substance alone. Mariani may not have understood the chemistry, but he certainly understood the results. Vin Mariani contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce. A typical dose was 1 or 2 wine glasses per day. This delivered roughly 20 to 40 milligrams of cocaine, a moderate dose that produced mild stimulation and mood elevation without overwhelming intoxication. For comparison, a typical line of cocaine today contains 50 to 75 milligrams, though modern street cocaine is rarely pure. Mariani marketed his product with genius. He claimed Vin Mariani could nourish, fortify, refresh, aid digestion, strengthen the system. He solicited testimonials from famous figures across Europe and America, and he received them in abundance. The list of Vin Mariani enthusiasts reads like a who's who of late 19th century culture and politics. Pope Leo XIII was perhaps the most prestigious endorser. The Pope not only drank Vin Mariani, but appeared on advertising posters endorsing it. He awarded Mariani a special gold medal and permitted the free use of his image in advertisements. Later, Pope Pius X also became a Vin Mariani enthusiast. For a product to be endorsed by the Catholic Church in an era when the Church wielded immense cultural influence was marketing gold. Thomas Edison claimed Vin Mariani helped him stay awake during long work sessions. Ulysses S. Grant drank it while writing his memoirs in the final months of his life, battling throat cancer and racing to complete his autobiography. The French Prime Minister Jules Méline drank Vin Mariani despite being otherwise opposed to alcohol consumption. Writers including Émile Zola, Robert Louis Stevenson, Jules Verne, and Alexandre Dumas provided testimonials. Actresses like Sarah Bernhardt praised it publicly. The endorsements were genuine. These were not paid celebrity spokespeople in the modern sense, though Mariani likely provided free wine to influential figures. People genuinely enjoyed Vin Mariani. It made them feel good. It was legal, socially acceptable, even prestigious. Wine was already a respectable beverage in Europe. Adding coca simply made it more interesting. Vin Mariani's success inspired imitators. Dozens of coca wines appeared on the market, each claiming unique formulations and benefits. The competition became fierce. When Mariani attempted to export to America, he found that American consumers expected stronger doses. He increased the cocaine content of his export formula to 7.2 milligrams per ounce to compete with American coca wines that contained even higher concentrations. The American market for cocaine products exploded in the 1880s and 1890s. Pharmaceutical companies produced cocaine in various forms. Parke-Davis, one of the largest pharmaceutical manufacturers in America, sold cocaine in multiple preparations: coca leaf cigarettes, cocaine for injection, cocaine in cordials, and crystalline cocaine for snorting or dissolving. Their advertisements promised that cocaine would supply the place of food, make the coward brave, the silent eloquent, and render the sufferer insensitive to pain. Other companies marketed cocaine-laced tonics, lozenges, and drops. Cocaine toothache drops were particularly popular, sold specifically for children. The numbing effect of cocaine did relieve tooth pain, though the habit of giving cocaine to children strikes modern sensibilities as horrifying. But in the 1880s, without any framework for understanding addiction or the unique vulnerabilities of developing brains, such products seemed logical. Patent medicines containing cocaine proliferated. These were proprietary formulas, often with exotic names and grandiose claims, sold without prescription or regulation. Some contained substantial amounts of cocaine. Others contained trace amounts but made exaggerated claims about coca content to capitalize on cocaine's reputation. The patent medicine industry was largely fraudulent, but that didn't stop millions of Americans from purchasing these products. The cultural impact of cocaine in this period cannot be overstated. In just 2 decades, from roughly 1880 to 1900, cocaine went from an obscure substance known only to a few chemists to a ubiquitous presence in American and European life. It was in wine and soft drinks, in medicines and tonics, in cigarettes and candies. It was prescribed by physicians, sold by pharmacists, and consumed by people of all social classes. Literature of the period reflected cocaine's presence. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes was depicted as a cocaine user, injecting the drug to relieve boredom between cases. Doyle, himself a physician, was familiar with cocaine's effects and portrayed them with some accuracy, including both the stimulation and the subsequent depression. Robert Louis Stevenson reportedly wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in a 6-day cocaine-fueled writing binge, producing a story that can be read as an allegory for drug-induced transformation. The economics of cocaine were substantial. Coca leaf cultivation in South America expanded dramatically to meet European and American demand. Processing facilities were established to extract crude cocaine from coca leaves before shipping. By the 1890s, Peru was exporting substantial quantities of coca leaves and coca paste. Bolivia developed coca plantations. Even Java, then a Dutch colony, began cultivating coca on a large scale. By 1912, Java was exporting 1,000 tons of coca leaves annually to Amsterdam, overtaking Peru as a major supplier. The lack of regulation meant that consumers had no reliable information about what they were consuming or in what quantities. Products varied wildly in cocaine content. What one manufacturer called a mild tonic might contain 10 times the cocaine of another product, making identical claims. There were no dosing guidelines, no warnings about dependency, no age restrictions. Cocaine was simply another ingredient, like alcohol or caffeine. But cracks were beginning to appear in the cocaine enthusiasm. Physicians were seeing troubling cases. Patients who had become dependent on cocaine medications, individuals who had escalated their cocaine use to dangerous levels, cases of cocaine psychosis, cardiovascular events, unexplained deaths. Medical journals began publishing case reports that questioned cocaine's safety. The medical community's attitude toward cocaine in the 1890s was complex. On one hand, cocaine remained the only effective local anesthetic available, making it invaluable for certain surgical procedures. On the other hand, evidence of cocaine's dangers was mounting. Physicians found themselves in the awkward position of condemning cocaine abuse, while still relying on cocaine for legitimate medical uses. By 1900, the tide of opinion was turning decisively against cocaine. The exuberant promotion of the 1880s gave way to growing alarm. Stories of cocaine addiction appeared regularly in newspapers. Reform-minded journalists exposed the patent medicine industry's abuses. Medical societies called for regulation. Public health advocates campaigned against cocaine-laced products marketed to children. The cocaine boom was approaching its end, though it would take another decade before legal restrictions were implemented. The early 20th century would see a transformation in how cocaine was perceived, from miracle drug to dangerous narcotic, from prestigious tonic to social menace. But first, cocaine would enter American popular culture through its association with one of the most famous products ever created, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, American dreams in a bottle. The story of Coca-Cola is inseparable from the story of cocaine. The world's most famous soft drink was created as a cocaine-containing medicine, marketed initially as a patent remedy, and gradually transformed into a global beverage brand. The history is complex, sometimes deliberately obscured by the company itself, but well documented enough that the basic facts are clear. John Stith Pemberton was born in 1831 in Georgia. He served as a Confederate lieutenant colonel during the American Civil War, where he suffered severe wounds. Like many wounded soldiers, Pemberton became dependent on morphine for pain relief. Morphine addiction was tragically common among Civil War veterans. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides returned home addicted to the drug, creating what some called the soldier's disease. After the war, Pemberton pursued careers in pharmacy and chemistry. He established a drug business in Columbus, Georgia, and later moved to Atlanta. He developed various patent medicines and pharmaceutical preparations. And he struggled with his morphine addiction. He was searching for something that could help him reduce morphine use, or at least make life more tolerable while dependent on it. Pemberton was certainly aware of Vin Mariani's success. Angelo Mariani's Coca wine had gained tremendous popularity by the mid-1880s, praised by celebrities and physicians alike. Pemberton decided to create his own version, an American Coca wine that could compete with the imported French product. In 1885, Pemberton created Pemberton's French wine Coca. His formula included coca leaf extract, red wine, cola nut extract, a source of caffeine, and various flavorings. The combination of cocaine from coca and caffeine from cola nuts created a powerful stimulant effect. Wine provided the liquid base and enhanced cocaine's effects. The product was marketed as a nerve tonic and remedy for headaches, neuralgia, hysteria, and melancholy. Pemberton's French wine Coca gained some local success in Georgia. But in 1885, temperance advocates succeeded in passing prohibition legislation in Atlanta and Fulton County to take effect the following year. This created a problem. Pemberton's wine-based Coca drink would be illegal to sell once prohibition began. Pemberton responded by reformulating his product. He removed the wine and replaced it with sugar syrup and carbonated water. He adjusted the flavoring profile, adding vanilla, citrus oils, and other ingredients to create a distinctive taste. The result was no longer a Coca wine, but a carbonated soft drink containing coca extract and cola nut caffeine. He called it Coca-Cola. The first Coca-Cola was sold at Jacobs's Pharmacy in Atlanta in May 1886. The initial sales were modest. Pemberton's bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, suggested the name Coca-Cola, noting that the two C's would look good in advertising. Robinson created the flowing script logo that remains Coca-Cola's trademark to this day. The original Coca-Cola formula included approximately 5 ounces of coca leaf extract per gallon of syrup. This coca extract contained cocaine, though the exact amount is difficult to determine from historical records. When mixed with carbonated water at a soda fountain, a typical serving of early Coca-Cola contained somewhere between 5 and 10 milligrams of cocaine, roughly the equivalent of a small line of modern street cocaine, though the delivery method and absorption rate were quite different. The cocaine content gave Coca-Cola its distinctive appeal. The drink was stimulating, mood-elevating, and mildly euphoric. Combined with caffeine from cola nuts and substantial sugar content, Coca-Cola delivered a powerful lift. It was marketed initially as a brain tonic and temperance drink, appealing both to people seeking medicinal benefits and those looking for an alternative to alcohol in an increasingly prohibitionist South. John Pemberton's health was failing. He continued to struggle with morphine addiction and may have developed stomach cancer. In 1888, he sold his interest in Coca-Cola to Asa Griggs Candler, an Atlanta businessman and pharmacist, for $2,300. Pemberton died in August 1888, just 2 years after creating the formula that would become one of the world's most valuable brands. Under Candler's leadership, Coca-Cola expanded dramatically. Candler was a skilled marketer with ambition and business acumen. He standardized the formula, established a bottling system, and launched aggressive advertising campaigns. By the 1890s, Coca-Cola was being sold across the American South, and sales were spreading northward and westward. The advertising emphasized Coca-Cola's stimulating and refreshing properties. Slogans promised it would cure your headache, relieve mental and physical exhaustion, and restore vim, vigor, and vitality. The cocaine content was not hidden, but neither was it prominently featured. The name itself referenced coca, but in an age when cocaine-laced products were common, this attracted little attention. Coca-Cola's success was extraordinary. Within a decade of Candler's takeover, it was being sold in every US state. The distinctive contoured bottle introduced in 1916 made Coca-Cola instantly recognizable. The drink became associated with American culture, American optimism, American modernity. But that success was built, at least initially, on a formula containing an increasingly controversial drug. By the turn of the century, attitudes toward cocaine were changing rapidly. The same concerns that were ending the patent medicine era were now focused on Coca-Cola. How much cocaine did it really contain? Was it safe for children? Should a beverage available at any soda fountain contain a drug known to cause addiction? The company began to feel pressure. In 1891, under Candler's direction, the amount of coca extract in Coca-Cola was reduced significantly, to about 1/10 of Pemberton's original formula. This reduced the cocaine content to roughly 1 milligram per serving, a trace amount that would produce minimal effects. But even this was controversial. In 1903, the Coca-Cola Company made a crucial decision. They stopped using fresh coca leaves and switched to spent leaves that had already been processed to extract cocaine for pharmaceutical use. These spent leaves contained only trace amounts of cocaine. The resulting Coca-Cola still had the coca flavor, but the cocaine content was reduced to virtually nothing. This change was driven partly by concern about cocaine's reputation and partly by the looming threat of regulation. By 1903, state and local governments were beginning to restrict cocaine sales. The federal government was considering national legislation. Candler recognized that Coca-Cola's future depended on removing cocaine as a significant ingredient while maintaining the drink's popularity. The transition was carefully managed. The company never publicly announced that cocaine had been removed. They simply reformulated quietly and continued using coca extract made from spent leaves. Coca-Cola advertisements stopped mentioning specific ingredients and focused instead on taste and refreshment. The strategy worked. Most consumers never noticed any change. In 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required accurate labeling of ingredients and prohibited certain false claims. This legislation, driven by muck-raking journalists and public health reformers, transformed the patent medicine industry and food production. For Coca-Cola, it meant that any cocaine content, no matter how small, had to be acknowledged. The Coca-Cola Company maintained that their product contained no significant cocaine, and technically this was accurate. The spent coca leaves used after 1903 contained only infinitesimal traces. But the question of whether even trace amounts were acceptable became a point of contention. In 1909, the federal government actually seized a shipment of Coca-Cola syrup, claiming it contained harmful ingredients. The case eventually went to the Supreme Court, which ruled in the company's favor, but the controversy demonstrated how sensitive the issue had become. By 1929, The Coca-Cola company had developed a process for treating coca leaves that removed all cocaine alkaloids while preserving flavor compounds. This finally ended any cocaine content in Coca-Cola. The process is still used today. The Stepan Company in New Jersey imports coca leaves from Peru and Bolivia, extracts cocaine for pharmaceutical sale, and sells the decocainized extract to Coca-Cola. It's a curious arrangement. Coca-Cola, which began as a cocaine-containing patent medicine, still uses coca leaves, but the cocaine is removed before the leaves reach the soft drink company. The story of Coca-Cola and cocaine reveals how a drug that was once unremarkable, even respectable, became controversial and eventually prohibited. In 1886, when John Pemberton first mixed coca extract with carbonated water, including cocaine seemed natural, even beneficial. By 1906, it was becoming scandalous. By 1929, it was essential to remove completely. The cultural meaning of cocaine had transformed within a single generation, but Coca-Cola itself remained. The drink outlived cocaine, becoming one of the world's most recognized brands. The name still references coca, a reminder of its origins, and the distinctive flavor derived partly from decocainized coca leaf extract carries a trace of the plant that indigenous Andean peoples have revered for millennia. The sacred leaf became a commodity, then an addictive drug, then an illegal substance, and finally, in its most neutered form, a flavoring agent in soda. The transformation is complete. The turn against cocaine, regulation and prohibition. As the 19th century became the 20th, cocaine's reputation underwent a dramatic reversal. The miracle drug of the 1880s became the dangerous narcotic of the 1900s. This transformation was driven by multiple factors: mounting medical evidence of cocaine's harms, racist propaganda that falsely linked cocaine to crime and violence, progressive reform movements targeting patent medicines, and a broader cultural shift toward prohibition and moral regulation. The medical evidence came first. By the early 1900s, physicians had decades of experience with cocaine and its effects. They had seen countless cases of cocaine addiction, with patients unable to stop using despite severe health consequences. They had treated cocaine psychosis, cardiovascular complications, seizures, and deaths from overdose. The initial enthusiasm had given way to grim reality. Medical journals published case studies documenting cocaine's dangers. A particularly influential 1902 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association reviewed cocaine's medical uses and concluded that while it remained valuable as a local anesthetic, its use as a general stimulant was medically unjustifiable and often harmful. The article cited numerous cases of addiction, noting that cocaine dependency could develop rapidly and was extremely difficult to overcome. Dentists, who had embraced cocaine enthusiastically in the 1880s as a painless way to perform extractions and other procedures, began reporting complications. Repeated cocaine use for dental anesthesia was causing tissue damage, particularly to nasal passages when cocaine was used for nasal procedures. Cases of necrosis, infection, and cardiovascular events following dental cocaine use appeared in medical literature. The public health perspective was also shifting. Progressive-era reformers concerned about patent medicines and food safety began targeting cocaine-containing products. Muckraking journalists wrote exposés about the patent medicine industry, revealing how companies misled consumers, made false medical claims, and included dangerous ingredients without disclosure. Samuel Hopkins Adams's series The Great American Fraud, published in Collier's Weekly in 1905 and 1906, was particularly influential, exposing numerous patent medicine frauds, including cocaine-laced products marketed to children. This reform movement culminated in the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. The law required accurate labeling of ingredients and prohibited false or misleading claims. For cocaine-containing products, this meant that the cocaine content had to be disclosed on labels. Many manufacturers reformulated their products to remove cocaine rather than risk sales by acknowledging its presence. But the most powerful force driving cocaine prohibition was neither medical evidence nor consumer protection. It was racism. In the early 1900s, particularly in the American South, false stories circulated claiming that cocaine made black men violent, sexually aggressive, and impervious to pain. These stories were invented propaganda designed to justify racial segregation and violence, but they gained widespread acceptance among white Americans. Newspapers published sensational stories about cocaine-crazed Negroes committing crimes. Police departments claimed they needed larger caliber handguns because cocaine made black men unstoppable. Southern politicians argued that cocaine was causing black men to forget their place in the racial hierarchy. None of this was true, but truth was irrelevant to the propaganda's purpose. The racist anti-cocaine campaign was led partly by Dr. Hamilton Wright, who was appointed by President Theodore Roosevelt to serve as the first opium commissioner of the United States. Wright used blatantly racist language, claiming that cocaine use by black men in the South was causing a crime wave and sexual assaults on white women. He presented fabricated statistics, distorted case reports, and inflammatory rhetoric. His goal was to generate support for federal anti-drug legislation, and he was successful. It's important to state clearly, these racist claims about cocaine were false. There was no evidence that black Americans used cocaine more than white Americans. There was no evidence that cocaine caused the specific behaviors attributed to it in racist propaganda. Modern research has shown that cocaine does not make users violent or increase criminal behavior except insofar as the illegal drug trade itself generates violence. The early 20th century propaganda about cocaine and race was a fabrication designed to justify racial oppression. But the propaganda worked. By 1910, many states had passed laws restricting cocaine sales. Some required prescriptions, others banned cocaine entirely except for specific medical uses. The regulation varied by state, creating a patchwork of laws that made interstate commerce in cocaine increasingly complicated. The federal government moved toward comprehensive drug legislation. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, passed in 1914, required registration and taxation of anyone importing, manufacturing, or distributing narcotic drugs, a category that included both opium derivatives and cocaine. The law was framed as a tax measure, but its effect was to create a federal framework for controlling these drugs. Under the Harrison Act, physicians could prescribe cocaine for legitimate medical purposes, and pharmacists could dispense it with a prescription. But recreational use, patent medicines containing cocaine, and over-the-counter cocaine sales became illegal. Enforcement began slowly but accelerated over the following years. The Act transformed cocaine from a legal commodity to a controlled substance. It also created the basic framework of American drug prohibition that persists today. The federal government claimed the power to regulate drugs through the tax power granted by the Constitution. This approach survived legal challenges and established the precedent for more comprehensive drug legislation later. World War I temporarily disrupted cocaine supply chains, as shipping lanes were disrupted and European chemical plants that had manufactured cocaine shifted to wartime production. This reduced cocaine availability in America and Europe during the war years. When the war ended, the legal landscape had changed. The Harrison Act was being enforced more strictly. States had passed additional restrictions. The era of legal cocaine was effectively over. By 1920, cocaine had gone from ubiquitous to underground. The transition took only about 15 years. The same drug that had been prescribed by physicians, sold by pharmacists, included in patent medicines, and consumed by millions, was now illegal for most uses. Possession without a prescription became a criminal offense. The manufacture and distribution of cocaine for non-medical purposes became a federal crime. The medical profession retained access to cocaine for use as a local anesthetic, particularly in ophthalmology, otolaryngology, and dental surgery. But even this legitimate use declined as safer alternatives were developed. Procaine, Novocaine, was synthesized in 1905 and gradually replaced cocaine for most dental and surgical purposes. It provided local anesthesia without cocaine's cardiovascular effects or addiction potential. By the 1930s, cocaine had largely disappeared, even from legitimate medical practice. Underground cocaine use continued, but at much lower levels than before Prohibition. Cocaine was expensive, increasingly difficult to obtain, and associated with serious legal consequences. Most users switched to other drugs or stopped using stimulants altogether. A small subculture of cocaine users persisted, primarily in cities, in bohemian and criminal circles, but cocaine faded from public consciousness. For several decades, roughly from the 1930s to the 1960s, cocaine was almost forgotten. It appeared occasionally in literature and film as a symbol of decadence or criminality, but it was not a major drug of abuse. Heroin, marijuana, and later amphetamines drew more concern from law enforcement and public health officials. Cocaine seemed like a relic of an earlier era. This relative obscurity would not last. In the 1970s, cocaine would roar back into American life, but in a very different context. The legal restrictions remained, but new smuggling routes, new markets, and new user populations would create a cocaine boom that dwarfed anything seen in the 19th century. The story of cocaine was far from over. The Colombian connection, building an empire. To understand how cocaine transformed from a nearly forgotten drug in the 1960s to a global commodity worth billions by the 1980s, we must turn to Colombia. The story of Colombian cocaine trafficking is complex, involving geography, politics, economics, entrepreneurship, and violence on a scale difficult to comprehend. At the center of this story stands one figure who has become almost mythological: Pablo Escobar. Colombia's role in cocaine production was not inevitable. Coca plants are not native to Colombia. They originated further south, in Peru and Bolivia, countries with long histories of coca cultivation. But several factors converged in Colombia in the 1970s to make it the epicenter of global cocaine trafficking. First, Colombia's geography was ideal. The country borders both the Caribbean and Pacific, providing multiple routes for smuggling. The rugged terrain includes vast areas beyond effective government control. The Andes Mountains run through the country, providing high-altitude zones suitable for coca cultivation. The Amazon basin extends into southern Colombia, offering remote growing areas. Colombia sits at the nexus between coca-producing regions to the south and the lucrative North American market to the north. Second, Colombia had existing smuggling networks. For decades, Colombian traffickers had smuggled other contraband: emeralds, marijuana, and various legal goods subject to high tariffs. These networks had experience in moving products secretly, corrupting officials, and establishing distribution channels. When cocaine demand surged in the United States in the 1970s, these existing networks could be adapted. Third, Colombian organized crime had developed significantly. Various criminal groups operated in different regions of Colombia, often with political connections or operating in territories where government authority was weak. These groups had experience with violence, corruption, and territorial control. They had the organizational capacity to manage complex operations. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, North American demand for cocaine exploded in the 1970s. Cocaine became fashionable among wealthy Americans. It was seen as a sophisticated drug associated with success, confidence, and sexual potency. Demand far outstripped supply, driving prices high and creating enormous profit opportunities for anyone who could produce and transport cocaine in quantity. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born in 1949 in Rio Negro, Colombia, and raised in Medellin. His father was a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher. He came from modest means but showed entrepreneurial spirit from a young age. As a teenager and young man, he engaged in various petty crimes, selling fake diplomas, smuggling cigarettes, stealing tombstones to resell, car theft. Nothing suggested he would become one of the wealthiest criminals in history. Escobar entered the cocaine trade in the mid-1970s, initially working for others, learning the business. He was ruthless, intelligent, and ambitious. He saw the enormous profits possible in cocaine and understood that controlling the entire supply chain, from coca paste purchase to cocaine distribution in the United States, would maximize profits. He began building the organization that would become the Medellin Cartel. The term cartel is somewhat misleading. The Medellin organization was not a single unified structure, but a federation of independent traffickers who cooperated when advantageous. Escobar was the most powerful figure, but other major players included Jorge Luis Ochoa, Fabio Ochoa, Juan David Ochoa, Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, and Carlos Leda. Each controlled different aspects of the cocaine trade: production, transportation, distribution, enforcement. They coordinated operations but maintained separate organizations. Escobar's cousin, Gustavo Gaviria, handled much of the logistics. Gaviria was less flamboyant than Escobar, but equally important to the operation's success. He managed shipping arrangements, established transportation routes, coordinated with distributors, and handled the complex financial operations required to move billions of dollars in cash. The scale of the operation grew exponentially. In 1978, the Medellin networks transported approximately 19,000 kilograms of cocaine to the United States. Within a few years, they were moving hundreds of tons annually. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the Medellin cartel controlled an estimated 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. The organization was earning an estimated $420 million per week. Forbes magazine listed Escobar as one of the world's wealthiest people, with an estimated net worth of $25 billion. The logistics were staggering. Coca paste was purchased from growers in Peru and Bolivia. The paste was transported to processing laboratories hidden in remote areas of Colombia. There it was converted to cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder form suitable for snorting. The cocaine was packaged and transported to the coast or to airstrips. From there it was smuggled to the United States through various routes. Initially, much of the cocaine reached the US via Caribbean islands, particularly the Bahamas. Carlos Leda, one of the cartel's partners, purchased an entire island, Norman's Cay, approximately 220 miles southeast of Florida. From 1978 to 1982, the island served as a transshipment point. Planes would land carrying cocaine, refuel, and continue to airstrips in Florida. The operation was conducted openly, with cartel members living on the island, enjoying what was essentially a criminal paradise. Later, routes diversified. Some cocaine was smuggled by boat to Mexico and then across the US border. Some was transported via Central America. Some was flown directly to remote airstrips in the American South or Southwest. The cartel bribed officials at every level, from local police to customs agents to politicians. The money was so vast that corruption was often easy to achieve. Escobar himself was a paradox. He was ruthlessly violent, ordering the deaths of thousands. Judges, police officers, journalists, politicians, rival traffickers, and anyone who threatened the cartel's operations were murdered. Escobar pioneered the use of car bombs and coordinated attacks. The bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, which killed 110 people, was ordered by Escobar in an attempt to kill a presidential candidate who was not even on the plane. Yet Escobar also portrayed himself as a Robin Hood figure. He built housing for poor families in Medellin's slums. He constructed soccer fields and hospitals. He provided jobs and money to communities that had been neglected by the government. Many residents of Medellin saw him as a benefactor. When he walked through poor neighborhoods, people cheered. When he died, thousands attended his funeral. This duality was strategic. By building popular support, Escobar made it harder for the government to move against him. Informants were scarce because residents didn't want to betray someone who had helped their family. Hiding from authorities was easier when the local population protected you. Escobar understood that violence alone wouldn't secure power. He needed legitimacy, or at least tolerance, from the communities where he operated. Escobar also entered politics. In 1982, he was elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Chamber of Representatives. He used the position to channel money into public works projects, burnishing his image as a legitimate civic leader. But his political career was short-lived. A prominent journalist and politician, Luis Carlos Galán, began exposing Escobar's criminal activities. Galán forced Escobar out of Congress in 1984. Escobar had Galán assassinated in 1989. The Colombian government's response to the cartels was complicated. Some officials were corrupted, accepting cartel bribes. Others were intimidated, fearful for their lives and their families. Still others fought the cartels courageously, despite enormous personal risk. The cartels offered a choice captured in Escobar's famous phrase, plata o plomo, silver or lead, bribes or bullets. The United States became increasingly involved in fighting the Colombian cartels. The Drug Enforcement Administration established a strong presence in Colombia. US officials pressured the Colombian government to crack down on trafficking. Extradition treaties allowed major traffickers to be sent to the United States for prosecution, a threat the cartels fought desperately to prevent. The fight between the cartels and the Colombian state escalated throughout the 1980s. Escobar launched a campaign of terrorism, bombing buildings, assassinating officials, and attacking police stations. The violence was intended to force the government to negotiate, to abandon extradition, to leave the cartels alone. At times, it seemed the cartels might win. The violence threatened to destabilize Colombian democracy itself. In 1991, the Colombian government and Escobar reached an agreement. Escobar surrendered to authorities in exchange for guarantees that he would not be extradited and that he could serve his sentence in a prison of his own design. The prison, called La Catedral, was built on a hillside overlooking Medellin. It was less a prison than a luxury compound, complete with a soccer field, waterfall, nightclub, and elaborate security to keep enemies out rather than Escobar in. Escobar continued running his organization from La Catedral. He had visitors, made calls, and even conducted business meetings inside the prison. But when authorities learned that Escobar had tortured and killed 2 cartel associates inside La Catedral, they decided to move him to a real prison. When soldiers arrived to transfer him in July 1992, Escobar walked out a back door and escaped. For the next 17 months, Escobar was a fugitive. A massive manhunt ensued, involving Colombian police, army, the DEA, and a vigilante group called Los Pepes, Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. That was rumored to include members of the rival Cali cartel. Los Pepes conducted a campaign of terror against Escobar's family, associates, and properties, attempting to pressure him to surrender or to deprive him of resources. On December 2nd, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, Escobar was located in a middle-class neighborhood of Medellin. Colombian police, with support from US advisors, raided the location. Escobar and a bodyguard tried to escape across the rooftops. Both were shot and killed. Photographs of Escobar's body, surrounded by celebrating Colombian police officers, were broadcast around the world. The reign of the most powerful cocaine trafficker in history was over. But the cocaine trade was not over. The Medellin cartel fragmented after Escobar's death, but the Cali cartel quickly filled the void, controlling much of the cocaine trade throughout the 1990s until its leaders were also captured. Smaller, more decentralized organizations replaced the large cartels, but cocaine continued flowing north. The infrastructure, routes, and markets that Escobar helped create remained in place. The legacy of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel is complex. They transformed cocaine from a limited market into a mass commodity. They demonstrated that even powerful governments could be challenged by criminal organizations with sufficient resources. They corrupted Colombian institutions, killing thousands and traumatizing a nation. And they created a template that other drug trafficking organizations would follow, from Mexico to West Africa to Southeast Asia. The cocaine that arrived in US cities in the 1980s, thanks largely to the Colombian cartels, would have devastating effects. But the nature of that devastation depended on the form cocaine took and which communities it reached. The next chapter of cocaine's history would be written in America's inner cities, where a new form of cocaine, crack, would create a catastrophe. The crack epidemic, cities in flames. In the early 1980s, American cities experienced a transformation so rapid and devastating that it seemed to appear overnight. A new form of cocaine, smokable and cheap, flooded into neighborhoods already strained by poverty, unemployment, and neglect. This form, called crack or rock cocaine, would destroy lives, shatter families, and contribute to an explosion of violence that would scar urban America for decades. Crack cocaine is chemically similar to powder cocaine, but is processed differently. The creation method is simple. Cocaine hydrochloride is dissolved in water with baking soda, then heated. The mixture forms solid crystals or rocks that can be smoked. Smoking crack delivers cocaine to the brain far more rapidly than snorting powder. The high is more intense but much shorter, typically lasting only 5 to 15 minutes, followed by a severe crash that creates immediate craving for more. The origins of crack are somewhat murky. Some evidence suggests it first appeared in the Bahamas and Caribbean islands in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Caribbean immigrants, particularly from Jamaica and Trinidad, may have introduced crack to Miami and New York City. Around the same time, a similar product called rock cocaine emerged independently in Los Angeles. Whether these were truly independent inventions or whether the technique spread through informal networks is unclear. What is clear is that crack spread with frightening speed. By 1985, it was available in most major American cities. By 1987, the Drug Enforcement Administration reported crack cocaine was present in 46 states. The spread wasn't random. Crack concentrated in low-income, predominantly black inner-city neighborhoods that were already experiencing severe economic distress. Several factors made crack particularly destructive. First, it was affordable. While powder cocaine sold for $100 per gram or more, crack could be sold in small portions, sometimes for as little as $2.50 per dose. This made cocaine accessible to populations that had never been able to afford the powder form. Second, it was intensely addictive. The brief, intense high and severe crash created powerful cravings. Users often binged on crack for hours or days, consuming dose after dose. Third, it was highly profitable for dealers. Crack cocaine provided enormous profit margins, especially when sold in small quantities to desperate users. The crack market created new economic opportunities in communities where legal economic opportunities were vanishing. American cities in the 1980s were in crisis. Manufacturing jobs, which had provided stable employment for working-class urban populations, were disappearing as factories closed or moved overseas. The steel mills, automobile plants, textile factories, and other industrial employers that had sustained urban economies were shutting down. Unemployment, especially among young black men, reached catastrophic levels in some neighborhoods. Into this economic vacuum came crack. Selling crack required no education, no training, no startup capital beyond a small amount of product fronted by higher-level dealers. Young men, often teenagers, could earn more money selling crack than in any legal job available to them. The crack trade became an alternative economy, structured hierarchically with manufacturers, distributors, corner-level dealers, and lookouts. It employed thousands. But this economy came with horrific costs. The crack trade generated extreme violence. Dealers fought for territory, leading to shootouts in residential streets. Robberies targeting dealers or users were common. Retaliation cycles spiraled out of control. Between 1984 and 1989, the homicide rate for black males aged 14 to 17 more than doubled. For black males aged 18 to 24, it increased almost as much. These were not random killings, but concentrated in specific neighborhoods, often directly related to the crack trade. The violence extended beyond drug-related murders. Property crime increased as crack users, desperate for money to sustain their addiction, stole from homes, cars, and businesses. Robberies, often violent, became more frequent. The The social fabric of affected neighborhoods deteriorated as trust eroded and fear became pervasive. Residents, many elderly, became prisoners in their own homes, afraid to go out even during daylight. Crack addiction was particularly devastating to families. Users often neglected children. Some pregnant women used crack, leading to babies born with health complications, though the predicted epidemic of permanently damaged crack babies proved largely exaggerated by sensationalist media. The number of children entering foster care surged. Extended family networks, which had provided crucial support in black communities, were strained as multiple family members became addicted simultaneously. Women who used crack faced particular vulnerabilities. Some traded sex for crack, an arrangement that became depressingly common. This led to increased rates of sexually transmitted diseases, including a growing HIV epidemic. The combination of crack addiction, prostitution, and intravenous drug use — crack was sometimes used alongside heroin — created perfect conditions for HIV transmission in urban communities. The medical consequences of crack were severe. Emergency room visits for cocaine-related incidents skyrocketed. In 1985, there were about 26,300 such incidents. By 1986, the number increased to 55,200, a 110% jump in a single year. By the late 1980s, hospitals in major cities were overwhelmed with crack-related cases: heart attacks, strokes, seizures, respiratory problems, psychiatric emergencies. Crack psychosis, characterized by paranoia and hallucinations, was common among heavy users. Long-term crack use caused severe health problems. Cardiovascular damage was nearly universal among chronic users. Respiratory problems from smoking crack damaged lungs. Weight loss, often severe, resulted from crack's appetite suppressant effects. Dental problems earned the term crack mouth. Neurological damage affected cognition and impulse control. Many chronic crack users appeared years older than their actual age, their bodies ravaged by the drug. The response from political leaders and the media was swift but often misguided. News coverage of crack, especially after the cocaine-related deaths of basketball star Len Bias and NFL player Don Rogers in June 1986, was intense and often sensationalized. The term crack epidemic became ubiquitous. Politicians, especially during the 1986 midterm elections, competed to appear tough on drugs. This media and political attention had consequences. Public concern about drugs surged. A 1985 poll found that only 2 to 6% of Americans considered drug abuse a major national issue. By 1989, that number had jumped to 64%. The perception of crisis created political pressure for dramatic action. That action came primarily in the form of law enforcement. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed by Congress and signed by President Reagan, established harsh mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences. The law was particularly severe for crack cocaine, creating a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Possession of just 5 grams of crack triggered a mandatory 5-year prison sentence, while it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to receive the same sentence. This sentencing disparity had obviously racist effects. While crack and powder cocaine are pharmacologically similar, crack was used primarily by black Americans while powder cocaine was used primarily by white Americans. The result was that black defendants received far longer sentences than white defendants for equivalent amounts of cocaine. The law, though facially neutral, functionally created a racial caste system in cocaine sentencing. The crack epidemic also resulted in militarized policing in urban neighborhoods. SWAT-style raids became common. Stop-and-frisk policies expanded dramatically. Young black men were stopped, searched, and arrested at disproportionate rates. The prison population exploded. Between 1980 and 1997, the number of people incarcerated for drug offences increased from 50,000 to 400,000, an 8-fold increase. By 1995, nearly 1 in 3 young black men were either incarcerated, on probation, or on parole. The communities most harmed by crack were also most harmed by the law enforcement response. Mass incarceration removed fathers, brothers, and sons from families and neighborhoods. Criminal records made employment difficult even after release. The cycle of poverty, limited opportunity, and crime intensified. Some scholars have argued that the crack epidemic and the resulting war on drugs devastated black communities more thoroughly than crack itself ever could. Yet it's important not to simplify this history. Many black community leaders called for aggressive law enforcement against drug dealers. They saw their neighborhoods being destroyed and wanted protection. The Congressional Black Caucus largely supported the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. Many black residents supported strict policing, even as they were concerned about its implementation. The crack epidemic presented impossible choices: tolerate drug violence or accept harsh policing that often resulted in injustice. The crack epidemic also prompted community responses beyond law enforcement. Grassroots organizations formed to combat crack dealing. Herman Rice, in Philadelphia's Mantua neighborhood, founded Mantua Against Drugs, MAD, and led a 15-year campaign to drive dealers out and shut down crack houses. Similar efforts emerged in cities across America. Community activists, often mothers who had watched the epidemic devastate their neighborhoods, organized marches, created neighborhood watches, and confronted dealers directly. Public health responses were often inadequate. Treatment facilities were overwhelmed and underfunded. Many crack users wanted treatment but couldn't access it. The criminal justice system imprisoned addicts rather than treating them. Harm reduction approaches like needle exchange programs were politically controversial even as HIV spread. By the early 1990s, the crack epidemic began to wane. Several factors contributed. Increased law enforcement, despite its flaws, did remove some major dealers and disrupt distribution networks. The crack market stabilized, reducing violence. Younger people, seeing the devastation crack caused, were less likely to begin using. Treatment options, while still inadequate, improved, but the damage was done. The crack epidemic left scars on American cities that remain visible decades later. Families were broken, communities were traumatized, an entire generation was incarcerated. The political and cultural response to crack created lasting policies that shaped American criminal justice, often in destructive ways. The crack epidemic also revealed deep truths about American society. The speed with which crack spread through black urban neighborhoods, the severity of the response, and the long-term consequences all reflected existing inequalities. Crack didn't create poverty, unemployment, or racial discrimination. It entered communities already strained by decades of disinvestment, discrimination, and neglect. The epidemic was built on structural inequality, and the legal response to crack revealed how drug policy is shaped by race and class. Powder cocaine, used primarily by wealthy and middle-class white Americans, was treated far more leniently than crack, used primarily by poor black Americans. The disparity was so obvious that even conservative judges condemned the sentencing guidelines. Yet it took more than 2 decades before the sentencing disparity was partially addressed by the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which reduced the ratio from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, still unequal but less egregious. The story of crack is a story about cocaine, certainly, but it's also a story about America, about who is protected and who is punished, about which communities receive support and which receive surveillance, about how drugs are understood differently depending on who uses them. These patterns established during the crack epidemic continue to shape American drug policy today. The war on drugs, policy, punishment, and perpetual struggle. The phrase war on drugs has become so familiar that it's easy to forget it once meant something specific. When President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number 1 in June 1971, he launched a national campaign that would reshape American criminal justice, international relations, and domestic policy for generations. Understanding this war requires looking at its origins, its escalation, and its consequences. Nixon's war on drugs emerged from 1960s anxieties. Drug use had increased substantially among young people during the decade. Marijuana and LSD associated with the counterculture and anti-war movements seemed to threaten social order. Heroin addiction had spiked, particularly among soldiers returning from Vietnam, where the drug was readily available. Urban areas were experiencing rising crime rates. Politicians seeking to address voter concerns focused increasingly on drugs as both cause and symbol of social disorder. Nixon created the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, headed by Dr. Jerome Jaffe, and increased federal funding for drug control agencies. In 1973, he established the Drug Enforcement Administration, consolidating several agencies into a single organization focused on drug enforcement. These institutional developments created lasting infrastructure for drug prohibition, but Nixon's approach, despite harsh rhetoric, was relatively balanced compared to what would come later. Approximately 70% of Nixon's anti-drug budget went to treatment and prevention, with 30% for law enforcement and interdiction. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, which Nixon signed, actually reduced penalties for simple drug possession from felonies to misdemeanors and gave judges latitude in sentencing. Mandatory minimums that had been established in the 1950s were eliminated. The approach changed under President Ronald Reagan. Reagan took office in 1981 as drug use was actually declining nationally, but he nevertheless made drug prohibition a centerpiece of his domestic policy. In October 1982, Reagan officially announced his war on drugs, calling for increased law enforcement, harsher penalties, and military involvement in drug interdiction. Reagan's wife, Nancy, became the public face of the drug war with her Just Say No campaign, launched in 1984. The campaign focused on discouraging children from trying drugs through education and peer pressure. While well-intentioned, critics noted that Just Say No oversimplified addiction, ignored structural factors driving drug use, and placed responsibility entirely on individual choice while ignoring social context. The Reagan administration dramatically shifted federal drug policy toward punishment. Budgets for drug treatment and prevention were cut, while law enforcement budgets increased substantially. The DEA, FBI, and Department of Defense all saw their anti-drug budgets grow. Federal involvement in local policing expanded. Military equipment and tactics were adapted for domestic drug enforcement. The signature legislation of Reagan's drug war was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed shortly after basketball star Len Bias died of a cocaine overdose. The act appropriated $1.7 billion for the war on drugs and established 29 new mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. Until this law, the American criminal justice system had seen only 55 total mandatory minimums throughout its history. The act dramatically expanded the use of these inflexible penalties. Most notoriously, the 1986 Act established the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine discussed earlier. This disparity was not an accident, but reflected both moral panic about crack and underlying racial biases. The congressional debate over the act featured inflammatory rhetoric about crack cocaine's dangers, often laced with racist language and assumptions. The 1988 Anti-Drug Abuse Act went further, establishing a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for simple possession of crack cocaine, even without evidence of intent to distribute. This made crack the only drug for which a first-time possession offense triggered a mandatory minimum. The law also allowed public housing authorities to evict tenants for any drug-related activity, even without criminal convictions. These policies had devastating effects on poor communities. The political support for harsh drug laws was bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans competed to appear tough on crime and drugs. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus were divided, with some supporting harsh penalties as a way to protect their communities from drug violence, while others opposed the racial disparities in enforcement. President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, continued and in some ways expanded the war on drugs in the 1990s, rejecting recommendations to reduce crack sentencing disparities. The consequences of this approach were profound. The US prison population exploded. In 1980, approximately 500,000 people were incarcerated in state and federal prisons. By 2000, that number had grown to over 2 million. Much of this increase was driven by drug offences. By the early 21st century, nearly half of all federal prisoners were serving sentences for drug crimes. The racial disparities were stark and growing. Black Americans were arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for drug offences at rates far exceeding their proportion of drug users. Studies consistently showed that black and white Americans used drugs at similar rates, but black Americans were arrested and incarcerated at much higher rates. By 2000, black men were incarcerated for drug offences at rates more than 10 times higher than white men. These disparities resulted from multiple factors: the crack powder sentencing disparity, concentrated law enforcement in predominantly black neighborhoods, racial profiling, prosecutorial decisions, and systemic bias throughout the criminal justice system. The war on drugs, though facially race-neutral, functionally created a racial caste system. The international dimension of the war on drugs also escalated. The US provided military and financial aid to Latin American countries to fight drug production and trafficking. Plan Colombia, a multi-billion-dollar program launched in 2000, supported the Colombian government's fight against drug cartels and guerrilla groups. Similar programs operated in Bolivia, Peru, and Mexico. This international drug war had mixed results at best. Coca cultivation shifted from country to country as enforcement increased in one location. The balloon effect meant that pressing down production in one area caused it to expand elsewhere. Violence often increased rather than decreased. In Mexico, the drug war launched in 2006 has resulted in over 150,000 deaths and widespread corruption and state failure in some regions. The economic costs of the war on drugs have been staggering. Estimates suggest the US has spent over $1 trillion on drug prohibition since 1971. This includes law enforcement, prosecution, incarceration, military interdiction, and international aid programs. State and local governments spend additional billions, yet drug use has not decreased substantially. The goals of the war on drugs, by its own metrics, have not been achieved. Perhaps more important than the economic costs are the human costs. Millions of people, disproportionately black and Latino, have been incarcerated for drug offences. Criminal records have made employment, housing, and education difficult or impossible for millions more. Families have been torn apart. Communities have been destabilized. The collateral consequences of drug conviction extend across generations. The war on drugs has also contributed to police militarization. SWAT teams, originally created for rare hostage situations or active shooter scenarios, became routinely used for drug raids. No-knock warrants, which allow police to enter homes without warning, became common. Military equipment, including armoured vehicles, grenade launchers and automatic weapons, was transferred from the Department of Defense to local police departments through programs like the 1033 program. This militarization has made policing more dangerous for civilians. Numerous innocent people have been killed or injured in botched drug raids. Homes have been destroyed. The line between police and military has blurred. The Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures has been weakened by drug war exceptions. Public health approaches to addiction have been sacrificed to punishment. Treatment programs are chronically underfunded while prisons overflow. Harm reduction strategies, proven effective in other countries, face political opposition. Needle exchange programs, which reduce HIV transmission, are controversial despite strong evidence of effectiveness. Supervised injection facilities, which save lives and connect users with treatment, are illegal in most of the US. However, attitudes have been shifting. By the 2010s, a growing consensus emerged that the war on drugs had failed. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced the crack powder sentencing disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. though not eliminating it entirely. Some states began reducing sentences for drug offences and increasing funding for treatment. Marijuana legalization spread to multiple states, representing a significant departure from prohibition orthodoxy. The coronavirus pandemic accelerated some reforms as states sought to reduce prison populations. Some prosecutors adopted policies against prosecuting low-level drug possession. Drug courts, which divert addicts to treatment rather than prison, expanded. Medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction using drugs like buprenorphine became more accepted. Yet the fundamental framework of drug prohibition remains in place. Cocaine remains a Schedule II drug, illegal except for extremely limited medical use. Possession remains a crime in most states. The black market continues, with all its attendant violence and lack of quality control. International drug trafficking organizations remain powerful. Cocaine production continues. The war on drugs in relation to cocaine specifically has produced paradoxical results. Cocaine is more available now than at any point in history. Purity is higher than ever. Prices have dropped substantially, yet tens of thousands of people are incarcerated for cocaine offences at any given time. The policy has been expensive and destructive without achieving its stated goals. Looking at cocaine's history, from sacred leaf to criminalized powder, we can see how drug policy has been shaped by factors having little to do with the drug itself. Racism, moral panics, political opportunism, economic interests, and genuine, if misguided, concern about public health. Cocaine, the molecule, is the same whether consumed by Andean farmers in 1500 or Wall Street traders in 2020. What changed was not the drug, but how societies understood it, regulated it, and responded to it. Legacy, the powder that changed the world. We end where we began, with a plant growing in the high places of the world. The coca plant, Erythroxylum coca, continues to grow in the Andes, cultivated by farmers as their ancestors did for millennia. The plant has not changed. The cocaine alkaloid it produces is the same molecule that Albert Niemann first isolated in 1860, that Sigmund Freud experimented with in the 1880s, that was included in early Coca-Cola, that Pablo Escobar trafficked by the ton, that devastated American inner cities in the 1980s. But the story of cocaine is not really about a plant or a chemical. It's about how human societies relate to consciousness-altering substances, how power operates, how inequality shapes experience, how policy is made and implemented. Cocaine has been many things: sacred medicine, miracle drug, valuable commodity, dangerous narcotic, tool of oppression, symbol of rebellion, source of immense wealth, cause of incalculable suffering. These meanings were not inherent in the molecule, but were constructed by people and institutions. Today, cocaine remains widely used. Current estimates suggest approximately 20 million people use cocaine globally. The cocaine trade generates tens of billions of dollars annually. Production continues primarily in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. European and North American markets remain strong, while consumption has increased in Asia, Africa, and Australia. The globalization of cocaine markets means the drug has reached virtually every corner of the world. The human costs remain severe. Cocaine addiction continues to destroy lives and families. Cardiovascular complications, strokes, and other medical emergencies resulting from cocaine use kill thousands annually. The cocaine trade fuels violence in producing and trafficking countries. Environmental damage from coca cultivation and cocaine processing contaminates rivers and destroys rainforests. Yet the policy responses remain largely unchanged from the war on drugs framework established decades ago. Cocaine is still criminalized in virtually every country. Enforcement, prosecution, and incarceration remain the primary responses. Treatment and harm reduction receive comparatively minimal funding and support. The international drug control system, codified in UN treaties from the 1960s and 1970s, remains prohibitionist in approach. Some scholars and advocates argue for fundamentally different approaches. They point to evidence from countries that have decriminalized drug possession, increased treatment funding, and emphasized public health over punishment. Portugal, which decriminalized possession of all drugs in 2001, has seen reductions in drug-related deaths and HIV transmission without significant increases in drug use. Other countries have experimented with supervised consumption sites, prescription heroin programs, and other harm reduction strategies with promising results. But any discussion of drug policy reform must grapple with cocaine's history. The drug has caused immense harm, not just through addiction and health consequences, but through the violence, corruption, and social disruption of the illegal trade. Simply legalizing cocaine would not solve these problems and might create new ones. Yet continuing prohibition has not prevented harm and has added layers of additional problems: mass incarceration, police violence, black market violence, absence of quality control, inability to seek help without legal consequences. There are no easy answers. Cocaine exists, people use it, and societies must respond. But how they respond matters enormously. Policies based on moral panic rather than evidence, on punishment rather than treatment, on racial bias rather than public health, have failed. We know this because we have decades of evidence. The challenge is developing approaches that reduce harm without increasing it elsewhere, that respect human dignity while acknowledging real dangers, that learn from history rather than repeating it. The indigenous peoples of the Andes maintained a relationship with coca for 8,000 years without the catastrophes that followed European contact. That relationship was based on tradition, ritual, community control, and respect for the plant's power. It was not perfect, but it was sustainable. When coca left that context, when it was isolated, industrialized, commodified, and prohibited, the relationship became pathological. Perhaps there's a lesson there. Not that we can or should return to traditional coca use, but that context matters enormously. How substances are used, who uses them, what social meanings attach to them, what support systems exist, what happens when use becomes problematic. All of these factors shape outcomes at least as much as the pharmacology of the drug itself. Cocaine's journey from sacred leaf to global commodity to prohibited substance has been shaped by conquest, capitalism, racism, science, politics, and human desire for altered consciousness. It has built fortunes and destroyed lives. It has been medicine and poison, escape and trap, pleasure and pain. The story of cocaine is in many ways the story of modernity itself, the promise of science and technology, the dark side of capitalism and colonialism, the unequal distribution of harm and benefit, the unintended consequences of policy. As you settle into sleep, consider how one plant, one alkaloid, could have such enormous consequences. Think about the coca plants still growing in the Andes, the farmers who harvest them, the laboratories hidden in jungles where paste becomes powder, the smuggling routes across oceans and borders, the distribution networks in cities, the users seeking escape or energy or euphoria, the law enforcement apparatus trying to suppress an economic force worth billions, the people sitting in prisons for possessing a white powder, the families torn apart, the communities devastated, the policies that have shaped lives and nations. The story of cocaine is not over. The plant still grows, the trade continues, people still use, policies still fail, and societies still struggle with how to respond. What comes next will depend on whether we learn from the past or repeat it, whether we choose punishment or treatment, whether we see drug use as a moral failing or a public health challenge, whether we address the underlying conditions that drive problematic drug use or simply warehouse those affected. For now, rest. The night is long, and these questions have no easy answers, but understanding the history helps. Knowing how we arrived at this moment, what forces shaped cocaine's transformation from sacred leaf to criminal substance, what consequences followed each policy choice, this knowledge is essential. Not because history determines the future, but because it illuminates the present and suggests possibilities for change. The coca plant grows still in the mountains. The cocaine molecule remains unchanged by all the meanings humans have attached to it. and millions of people continue to navigate the complex terrain between desire and danger, prohibition and use, policy and reality. The powder that corrupted dynasties, enriched criminals, destroyed communities, and reshaped American criminal justice continues its work in the world. What happens next is, in some sense, up to us. But tonight, let these thoughts drift away. Let the weight of this history settle into understanding rather than anxiety. The world will still be here in the morning, still wrestling with these questions. For now, rest. Dream perhaps of high mountain valleys where clouds touch earth, where a plant grows as it has for millions of years, indifferent to all the human drama surrounding it. In that indifference, perhaps, there's peace. Sleep well, and if you found value in this exploration of cocaine's complete history, remember to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, what surprised you, what you learned. These stories matter. This history matters, and sharing them helps us understand the world we live in. Good night.